Hello everyone, this is the recorded stream which I have with Bismarck about fighting conditions for pilots in World War II. He covers the Europe theater and I cover the Pacific.
Now, since this is Bernhard's topic, or he kind of did had the idea of it, I'll just gonna hand it over to you and let's get this started.
Yeah, thank you. So, well, for the Pacific, we will mainly focus on the South Pacific because it was the most hostile environment ever. And I will start with a quote from Fire in the Sky from Eric Bergerud, or Bergerud, I don't know how to pronounce it. The reason that Europeans and Southeast Asians had more or less ignored the Solomons and New Guinea for centuries was simply enough. Going to the South Pacific very likely meant death. This gives you a brief idea what the pilots faced there, and one of the many problems were diseases, and one of the strongest was, of course, malaria. And it's quite interesting. The pre-war policy for malaria was if a pilot had contracted malaria, he was grounded for 2 years, not showing any symptoms, and then he was allowed to fly again. You probably can imagine that this was not possible anymore during the war.
Yeah, that would be really inconvenient for an Air Force to have pilots grounded for 2 years.
And of course, yep. You want to add something?
No, that was it, sorry.
So, and there were many other aspects in the Pacific which were quite important. Basically, the Allies were doing island hopping. And in the beginning, the frontline airfields were usually quite problematic. So they started to improve them. Usually the Allies way better than the Japanese. And once they basically finished an airfield, the front moved forward. So they hopped to the next airfield, which was in bad condition again. So this was only... So basically in the South Pacific, there was a lot of wear and tear on the machines, on the planes, and also on the pilots themselves. But I think let's switch to Europe for a bit. I think what would be really interesting is the situation on the Eastern Front.
Yes, so Eastern Front, that's a very, very special topic, of course. Since the Eastern Front is extremely long. We are talking about a theater of operations that essentially runs down from the north of Finland down to the Caucasus, pretty much. And the conditions that pilots found themselves in each of these kind of geographical areas are quite distinct. So when we talk about the conditions of pilots in the Eastern Front, we really have to differentiate pretty much between the north and the middle and the south regions. In the north, of course, you have a lot of snow during the winter months, and fall and spring are not exactly pretty months either, or pretty seasons either, although summer can be quite lovely. Now, during winter, of course, we have the problem that many planes aren't exactly equipped to handle snowy situations. We have a lot of squadrons that have to modify their aircraft, for example, with skis, to allow them to actually be able to use them. And that's not just talking about the machines, and that's not even talking about the living conditions at this point. As you can imagine, there are not exactly the ideal amount of airfields around the front lines with the quality of housing and facilities that would be needed during wartime operations. And you have a lot of pilots and ground staff who have to work in adverse conditions. Now, I'm just going to share very quickly one single picture here that I found quite interesting. And this is a Ju-87. No, that's the wrong one. This is the one that I want. And as you guys can see, we have about like a meter of snow. You see a horse pulling a cart with a ski, and we see a couple of bombs lying in the back and so on. These are not ideal conditions to operate your aircraft in. And these guys, one of them is actually lying on the wing. That's the first time I'm actually seeing this. But yeah, these guys, it's minus temperatures, and they have to operate their aircraft, and they have to get it fixed up for service. So the Eastern Front, this is the picture that we generally have of the Eastern Front, right? It's cold, it's ice, it's adverse. However, in the middle and in the southern regions, it's not quite like that. We also have some very dry and temperate kind of climate, where things are somewhat similar to, for example, Western Europe. And as long as the pilots have the facilities that are required for them, you actually have quite a good standard of living for them, and nothing that essentially compares to the Pacific. However, you do have moments, of course, where you are in a frontline airfield that has just recently been prepared. And when I say prepared, it's literally just finding a grass field, chopping down the trees, putting up a couple of barracks and calling it an airfield. So it's not exactly ideal either. But I think we'll return a little bit more to the Eastern Front later. What interests me, you said that in the Pacific you would be island hopping. Now, in the sources that you've read, is there anything that tells you how these pilots, for example, felt when flying over these vast amount of water, the oceans essentially in the South Pacific and the Pacific itself?
Yeah, when this was a major problem, less for the bombers, because they usually had a navigator. For instance, definitely the torpedo bombers usually had 3 people, and
Yes.
one was a navigator. So, but for fighter pilots, this was a major problem, flying over the vast amounts of the ocean. And also there are literally sometimes no navigational hints. And as you also know from the Kriegsmarine, not from the Kriegsmarine, from the Luftwaffe, that pilots need a special training for navigating over water.
Yes.
And of course, in the South Pacific, there was a bit more water. And what I found really interesting is the fact that the pilots sometimes, when they flew pretty low above the waters, they could see sharks and everything. But if they had the choice to jump out over the jungle or water, they would always choose water, because getting lost in the jungle was basically a death sentence. And there's one very interesting aspect where they had a situation where a plane started and the pilot and co-pilot dropped out, parachuted, because the plane was damaged or something. The co-pilot bailed out 3 miles away, and it took him to get back, and they had a search
from the
plane.
airfield, right?
From the airfield. And they had a search plane and natives and everything, and it took him 3 days to return. The other guy dropped out 7 miles away, and it took him 7 days to return.
Wow.
Here's the quote: "Most US soldiers never went inside the jungle because it was near suicide." So if you went down, it was curtains, except for those men we saved near our base. We never had a single prisoner of war or a single survivor from any of our men that went down.
Damn.
So, and as you mentioned, in World War II, most airfields were basically dirt tracks.
Yeah.
And
there's very few prepared airfields, and it actually requires a lot of effort to build an airfield. And that is not something you exactly want to invest in, especially if you're not sure if you're going to hold the territory that you're in. That's, for example, I don't want to encroach on your topic too much, but Henderson Field, for example, that's an airfield, a rather substantial airfield that the Japanese built. And once it was built, they actually got it finished ahead of schedule and were extremely pleased. They even gave their work party an extra food ration for that. About a week later, the US saw that it was finished, and they were like, "Oh, that's nice. That's a perfect airfield that we need." And they took it without a fight, essentially, because there were no defenses. So investing a lot of time and effort to actually build an airfield that qualifies to peacetime specifications is something that very few happens only a few times during the war.
Exactly, and this is a major problem in the Pacific, was that, for instance, you had to find the right location to even build one, because usually they are not long flat areas. So, and for an airfield, you need a long, quite flat area, and there were little. And the other problem was, of course, even if you found such a place, there's no infrastructure at all. Eastern Front doesn't have the best kind of infrastructure, but it's at least not everything is jungle and everything. So at least it's flat, and you can get there something in time. But on some island in the Pacific next to the harbor, if you can call it a harbor, it's quite different. So another issue was, as they mentioned, it's basically try and fail, because sometimes the place is ridden with malaria or other stuff, and it just doesn't work out. I mean, here's a quote: "A good base was not a good base was not only a strategic necessity; it was a gift from Mars, the ancient god of war."
Is that the same book?
Yeah, that's the same
Can,
book.
can you say the title again and the author, just so people can catch on for that again?
It's Fire in the Sky from Eric Bergerud. It's really interesting. A lot of information on this.
I'm going to type that in the chat in a second. Fire in the Sky.
By Eric M. Bergerud.
Bergerud. Okay, that's more or less the author's name. I probably misspelled that, guys. But if you're interested in that book, it is correct.
It's Eric without the H.
Oh, it's without the okay. It's the American version of Erich.
Yeah,
Eric. So if you want to check out that book, that I think you quoted like 3 times now, so it must be absolutely excellent. I myself have not yet read it. I am getting the feeling that I should. So that's probably a book that might be interesting to check out.
I have a question for you. Was there any specific mention about diseases on the Eastern Front? Was there a major problem for the pilots with diseases?
Not too much on the Eastern Front, more so in Africa.
Yeah, okay, in Africa, yeah, that makes sense.
On the Eastern Front, sanitation-wise, obviously it wasn't as great as on the Western Front, where this is a very compact operational theater where you can also get medical assistance very quickly. But diseases were mainly in Africa. And then the pilots usually had the lowest dropout rate because they were usually quite far away from the frontline units, let's say. And there's also a big difference between, for example, the German army in that sense and the Allied army. Because I know, for example, that the German Wehrmacht had absolutely no specification when it comes to sanitation. While the British, because I guess because of their colonial legacy, they had specific specifications that told their troops, okay, when we stop at a given point, the first thing you guys build is a makeshift toilet, for example. The Germans didn't have that, which from our perspective now seems somewhat bizarre. But there were quite a lot of dropout rates in Africa, in the Africa Corps, amongst the soldiers, not so much amongst the pilot. And in fact, Rommel was one of them. So that kind of goes to show how poorly the situation was managed in that regard. But yeah, maybe I'll just talk a little bit more about Africa then, since we're already on the topic. So Africa is a rather interesting operational theater for aircraft. First of all, because it's completely hostile to aircraft. It is not exactly where you want to bring a highly technologically advanced machine, because it's generally not built for those kind of purposes. Now, there were, of course, makeshift solutions to this. I'm just quickly gonna show another picture here. This is a BF-109, and it has an oil filter. And excuse me, not an oil filter. It's a kind of a tropical filter. That's what they call it. It's something that was placed on the cooling intake of the aircraft. Now, this is something that you see on pretty much all aircraft that was sent to Africa, the African theater. And the reason for this makes sense. For example, when you see this picture. Now, I can't fully say where this was taken, but as you can see, a couple of BF-109 starting. I don't know where it was taken and when, but when you see this picture, it makes sense that you don't want all this kind of stuff, all the sand in the cooling system of your aircraft. Obviously, visual range in a desert is quite impaired by this kind of sand. So taking off as a squadron was somewhat different than what you would expect, for example, on a airfield in Europe. So you had a lot of taking off takeoffs that were parallel to each other instead of behind each other, because you obviously can't do that. And you had a lot of ground staff helping you taxi the aircraft. For example, this is a Kitty Hawk, or a P-40, let's call it. Everybody always argues about the names, but there we go. You have a technician riding the wing, essentially telling the pilot where to go. Now, this is, of course, Kitty Hawk, or the P-40 is not the easiest plane to taxi. That is also a reason for it. But all this dust and so on is not helping either. So for theater of operations, just handling your aircraft in Africa is not exactly something that is straightforward. When it comes... Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, the BF-109, I mean, I know you don't like War Thunder, but in War Thunder, there's a tropical version of the BF-109, which would be that version. And here's the interesting part. The dust was a major problem. This is also mentioned in the book about the Pacific, because if it gets into the air filter, it gets in the whole machine. And these are highly, I mean, planes are generally high technology, and these were warplanes, so they were trimmed to be very high quality, and the margin of error was rather small. And another problem was from the dust, because you also had it in the Pacific. It was wet and then it was hot again, so you had also a lot of dust, but it also went into the instruments.
Yeah.
So sometimes they had to abort missions due to failed instruments, or even worse, there were accidents due to the dust damaging various instruments for the altimeter, the speedometer, or other instruments or other parts. And also about the taxing, I think Bergerud also mentioned something that taxing was quite dangerous, but I can't remember exactly why, but they had a lot of people that lost planes there.
No, it's in theaters like this that don't have, let's say, a temperate climate. You have a lot of wear and tear on the machines, and that is essentially something that is pretty much something that hounds the Luftwaffe in Africa quite severely. Because, for example, when JG-27 goes there, Jagdgeschwader 27, they start out with roughly, I think, 120 machines, and just before they pull out, I think they have 6 machines left. And not all, of course, a lot of those were lost to enemy action, but there were also dropouts from just the climate and from the conditions, something that would not have happened in a different kind of theater. Something that is perhaps goes into also what you said about this kind of vast open terrain in the Pacific, where pilots had to fly over, which was quite difficult. Something very similar is actually happening in Africa. Now, of course, we're not flying over water, we're flying over a hard surface land, but there's nothing there, except for the front lines and a few lines of supply lines. There's not a lot going on in Africa. So you have a lot of pilots, for example, when they are hit and they realize their plane is badly damaged, still they refuse to bail out because they don't exactly know where they are. They might have a gist of where they are because 30 minutes ago they flew by some kind of landmark that they recognize, or by some kind of village that they recognized, but they don't really know exactly where they are. So you see them, even when their engine is overheating, when there are oil leaks and so on, they're taking everything they can out of these engines, abusing them to a point where usually you would never take an engine like that, just in a desperate effort to get home, or at least get close to the front lines where you can then bail or try to crash land if you still think that you can save the aircraft, which is probably not going to happen at that point. But for example, yesterday when I was doing a little bit of reading here on this topic, I read the account of a pilot from JG-27 who essentially said that he took his aircraft's engine to roughly 200 degrees, and that is way over what it should be. The oil temperature was just off the meter, and he knew the engine was already destroyed. You're not going to get anything out of that engine afterwards, but he just kept the throttle wide open, trying to get home, and he just barely made it to the front line. He actually landed in a minefield, where then German pathfinders, which is kind of scouts, found him and they took him out. So he was very, very lucky. But that is something that you see a lot in Africa. And I guess you would also see it in the Pacific, perhaps, in a desperate effort to get back home. But it is not something that, for example, is something you will see in the Western theater of operations or in the East, because you have relatively short transit lines, and it's easy to bail out somewhere where you have a reasonable chance of getting home.
Yeah, I can't particularly remember something reading on that, but the one thing was clear: if they tried to land, they always tried to land near the coast, so not in the jungle, and ideally not in the water. So in a way, they were trying to get there. So I guess there's a difference. They probably tried to get as near as possible, but they were most of the time flying over water or jungle, whereas the desert is, you don't want to land in the desert, but it's at least somewhat possible. But yeah,
that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have one question, because I have something interesting here for another book to quote. The Caucasus, was there any issue with the maps and the altitude in specific ways that they had to adapt the maps or had certain troubles when they're flying over mountains?
Not that I specifically recall. It is, of course, a mountainous region, so I can imagine there being some issues with navigation there, especially in adverse weather. However, I know that the fighter pilots, the German fighter pilots, were usually grounded during bad weather in nearly all theaters of operation. So they wouldn't fly anyway. When it comes to the bomber pilots, they were specifically schooled in line flying and so on. Whether they would take it into the mountainous regions, I severely doubt it. So I guess if they had an operation planned for a specific area and they knew there were mountains, and they knew the weather was bad, then they probably wouldn't fly.
And they probably had pretty good maps, because for China, for operations in China, they had one problem, that the information was usually not good enough. So Curtis LeMay, those who know him, he was basically a bomber general, yeah. And he gave this instruction, to quote from Whirlwind, from Barrett Tillman: there was never enough information, not on weather, maps, or targets. Some charts were demonstrably wrong, leading LeMay to resort to the old airmail pilot's formula: at 2,000 feet to every mountain for oneself, and 3,000 more for the wife and children in altitude. So that you have a lot of margin, that you don't crash into a mountain, because they had quite some losses due to this when they were flying supplies in and out of China.
Can you just put the book into chat as well, so people?
Yeah, I will write it down while you talk on.
Yeah, for maps and so on, I'm not actually convinced that the Germans had excellent maps when it came to the regions that they were invading.
But it is not as bad, probably.
It probably not as bad, yeah. And I think they could also, since you can, of course, when Operation Barbarossa started, they overran quite a lot of airfields. So my guess is that they got a lot of their maps from the Russians themselves and then reproduced those. Now, I don't have any quote on that or any specific information, but it's just something that comes to mind now that I think about it. Also, the Germans did do quite a lot of reconnaissance flights. So it makes sense for them also to incorporate the information that they have there. And they did a lot of weather flights as well, with checking out the weather far away regions as well, and giving accurate information to their pilots. So that is, I think, generally the German approach. For the Russians, that is something I don't know, but yeah, the Germans certainly tried their best in that regard, I guess. All right, so that is going through some of the harsh theaters. We're going to, I think, return to the Pacific in a second again. One thing I want to talk about now, before we may perhaps turn our ourselves to the west is rescue operations. So I know, for example, in Africa, in the Eastern Front, when a pilot did get shot down, they did try their best to get him back. In Africa, this was, of course, even harder than anywhere else because you don't exactly know where he went down. In the Eastern Front, it's a little bit different. So, for example, I read an account from a Kampfgeschwader. They lost one of their bombers going into the Soviet territory. They saw where it went down, and on their fly out, because they took the same road flying out, the crew that crash landed shot up a signal flare. Now, the thing you got to remember is, of course, that in the Soviet Russia or in the Russian plains, there's a lot of open territory as well, where there are not a lot of soldiers. Even the Soviet army wasn't everywhere. So you have these guys shooting up a flare. The bomber pilots mark their position where they saw this flare being fired. And then they go off to their base, they report this, and if there is a possibility, they will try to send over, for example, a Fiesler Storch, if it's a fighter pilot, because that's only one guy, or they will send another plane. But they will not specifically do it as a rescue operation if they feel like the chances of getting these guys back is too low. So there was a little bit of calculation going on, and often they would instruct one or two crews to try to get these guys back on the next bombing operation. So these guys fly back in, bomb their target, and then two bombers, for example, would break off the formation, fly to the general area, see if there's another signal flare being fired up, land somewhere where they can. Usually the crews already made signal fires and so on. They would jump onto the plane and then fly out. These were quite hazardous. Sometimes you even would lose the rescue plane that did it and another one had to land. But if it did work out, you would get back an experienced crew, which sometimes I guess you can say as worth it, essentially. Now for the Pacific, however, rescue operations, I imagine, are quite complicated.
Actually, I don't have any information on this one. I don't have anything marked. I checked the index. There's nothing on rescue in there, so I have to pass on this. But I actually have a question for the Eastern Front, because many years ago I read the more or less, I think, biography or autobiography about Rudel, and in there it was mentioned that they regularly landed with, for instance, a Stuka and got and tried to get the other people in there. Was this also common, or is this just?
I wouldn't call it. It wasn't rare, but it was rather uncommon. The thing is that when you do a rescue operation, you have to clearly calculate the risks, because you already lost a pilot, an experienced pilot probably, who essentially is gone. There is still a chance of getting him back, but he's essentially gone. But now you're risking other pilots to do it. And this isn't like, for example, in the during Battle of Britain, when you had the Brits and the Germans operating rescue aircraft in the Channel. These are special squadrons or aircraft that are dedicated to this kind of operations, and they more or less know what they're doing. And it's also rather straightforward, let's call it. It depends, of course, on the weather, whether one of those planes can land, but it can also relay the information to one of the boats. We don't have that in the East, because you literally have to either hope that the pilot, if he landed in enemy territory, somehow sneaks back through the front lines, or you have to find him somewhere where you can actually land, and that's not easy. Now, an aircraft like the Fiesler Storch or the Stuka is relatively easy to land, relatively. I want to stress that, compared to some other planes for rescue operation, because they can operate on relatively harsh terrain, since they have quite a stable landing gear. It of course gets a lot more difficult if you have something like a bomber crew going down, because then you have to send a bomber to pick them up. And at that point, is it really worth it? I don't know. Now, there's a question here about Sirion. Did the Soviets send rescue missions? Yes and no. I've read of some of them, but I think they were rarer than with the Germans. but I'm not 100% sure on that. It also, I guess, depends on the time frame, because if the Soviet army is on the offensive, then they might not send a rescue mission, because they're going to expect that person maybe to just lay low for a couple of days and then be found by the vanguard of the Soviet army or something like this. So yeah. All right, so that's rescue operations pretty much dealt with. Oh yeah, I think in the Pacific, one thing I would mention, I think the Americans did operate their PBY, the Catalinas, as rescue aircraft. It is, of course, incredibly difficult to find somebody, even in a yellow rescue dinghy. The Japanese, I do remember reading, I think was it in Saburo Sakai's samurai book, that they did sometimes pick up a pilot when they found him, but I don't exactly know of any systematic effort to get them back. Usually, I guess they saw the chances of somebody who goes down over the Pacific as too slim to really worth the risk the effort, or put in the effort to get him back.
Yeah, probably should ask Justin on this one.
Yes.
He probably should know.
Absolutely. Justin will probably give us a very, very concise and good information on that.
He would say he doesn't really know and then talk for 15 minutes.
Okay, so Africa, Eastern Front, is there anything that we can, Pacific, maybe talk about again there? Is there anything that we missed before we maybe go to Western Europe?
Well, probably the only thing worth mentioning, which I mean, one interesting aspect about airfield construction is that the US usually contracted or got into the army experienced people from the civilian era, whereas the Japanese often used forced labor or draftees from Taiwan, for instance, or Korea. So there was also quite a difference in motivation and probably also qualification in building such airfields. So this also is very important because, well, how fast you can build an airfield or expand it is really important. And about the rescue thing, now I remember something. They built a lot of I don't know how they call it, not replacement, but additional small airfields where you could land in case of emergency or when you were damaged. So there were a few guys there, and then every few days or something, a plane landed there. But usually, I think they couldn't take off anymore because they were just rather small and emergency land strips.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember reading about something like that as well. So that definitely is something that we maybe should look into a little bit more, because it could come up with some interesting information. Now, I do remember that, for example, the Japanese, of course, captured the B-17 once, and I think that one is actually, it landed at the wrong airfield. So these things happened as well. Now, this is, of course, something that is quite common throughout the war, but I think in the Pacific that would be more common, since it's extremely hard to keep one island apart from the other one, let's say. But yeah, that I guess throws up an interesting discussion as well. Now, I guess we'll quickly go over Western Europe as well. There's not a lot to say about the operational theater there, since you already have, and when I say, of course, Western theater of operations, I mean generally the United Kingdom or the British Isles, France, and Germany. You generally have already very good facilities. These have been built in peacetime, operated by the Luftwaffe, the French Air Force, and the RAF. So you already have facilities that are well stocked and exactly what the different air forces need. Now, along the channel, you of course have a lot of makeshift, kind of smaller airfields where, for example, the Jagdgeschwaders were based and so on. Inland, you generally had the bombers. The bombers were generally given the better airfields because a bomber squadron obviously needs a lot of space. but it had a very accessible infrastructure, let's say. Living conditions in the West were also very good. For example, you will hear this said by any Luftwaffe pilot who has ever been stationed in France, that his time in France was the best, because generally they lived in a chateau. France has a lot of chateaus, by the way, so it's like a small kind of country villa, let's say. They would live there. The air crews were generally given the best food, the best drink. This is something actually that is true for the all theater of operations where the Germans were. The pilots always had plenty of drink. They got all the reserve stocks on pretty much any alcohol they could wish for. So in the West, you have a relatively quote unquote easy life. Now the fighting conditions are of course something different to that. For example, during the Battle of Britain, the German pilots some of them are so exhausted from their daily raids that there's more than once that you read an account of a pilot falling asleep at the controls of the aircraft as he's going towards the UK or back. That gives you like kind of a picture that even though they had plenty of good facilities of a good rest, good possibilities for rest, that they still the mental and the physical fatigue during these campaigns were quite high. Now, interesting of note is, for example, in Norway. Norway, especially the north, was very important to the German Air Force, since they could use their aircraft from based over there to strike the convoys that were going towards the Soviet Union. And a lot of the airfields that you now find in the north of Norway that are still quote unquote operational were actually built by the Germans back in World War II. And in fact, I have a friend who flew, he has a small private aircraft. He flew to the Nordkapp, the North Cape in Norway. And he said that he landed on an airfield that was built by the Germans. And that somebody over there explained it to him that actually this airfield only existed since, I think, 1942 or something it was. So that's quite interesting, I guess, to see how war required Germany to invest quite a lot of effort in to create an infrastructure up north in Norway that then was used to essentially intercept the convoys heading towards the Soviet Union. But yeah, that pretty much, that's the main things that I kind of want to say about the Western theater of operation. I don't want to say that or give the impression that it was easygoing. It certainly wasn't. Pilots had to fight just like in all the other theater of operations. They were under intense mental and physical stress. But when they had a choice and when they reflected back on it, they would generally say that they were happy to be stationed in the West. And I'm speaking now from the Luftwaffe's point of view, but I would think that it's, for example, the same for the Allied pilots that served on the UK and then went to Africa, or then went to Southeast Asia and then went back to the UK, that their best time or the easiest time, quote unquote, they had was probably flying out in Europe, in Western Europe.
Yeah, I have something to add here. There was actually a quote from a pilot. He didn't want to go back to the South Pacific for an anniversary. He said he hated this time there and the disease and everything, and he never wanted to see it again.
Wow.
And about the West, I think this is very important, as you point out. In the Western Europe, you basically had a very well built up infrastructure in general, and also the climate was relatively limited. So this means you can bring way more planes there because you have the infrastructure to maintain them and to have more airfields and everything, and sometimes they were already there. And the limited climate also reduces the wear and tear on the planes and also less stress on the pilots. But what the result of this is, you have more force concentration, or you can say the space force ratio is way higher on the Western front than on the Eastern front. I mean, this also with the ground troops and everything. So the war especially is quite different on the Western or Eastern front, or in the Pacific in that case, because if you look at the Pacific, there were a handful of divisions. Yeah, you needed a few divisions to capture a major strategic position, which on the Eastern front you don't show up with 2 to 3 divisions. You show up with at least 1 or 2 corps and Panzer Corps or something. So And this is what I'm actually planning to do a video on the space and force ratio, because this was mentioned in a Cambridge History of the Second World War article, which I found very interesting. I'm gathering data now, and this is just reflective of this again, because better infrastructure, you can support more troops, but this also means that the fighting will be more intense.
Yeah. Actually, now that you mentioned the keyword space, that brings me to another thing that I wanted to say about the Eastern Front. You have, or at least that's what I gather from the pilots' accounts that I read. You have a lot of kind of localized weather differences between the different areas. So, for example, if you think about a fighter squadron, these guys are usually very close to the front lines, whereas the bombers, like I mentioned, are further back. Now, it's quite often that it happens, for example, that a German Jagdgeschwader, and I would imagine it's the same for the Russians and the Soviets, would be forced to stand down for a day because in their specific area it was currently raining. At least from in their area very, very quickly. And I don't mean relocate as in going to another base, but as in going from A to B, since they're extremely fast aircraft. So flying out of this bad weather zone would be no problem. However, since there's bad weather in your area and the ground, for example, is soggy and you can't take off, you're grounded for the day. Now, it might very possibly be that 50 kilometers to the north or to the south from you or to the east, the weather is perfectly fine, and now the opposing force, the Soviets or the Germans, are now bombing your ground forces, and you can't assist or you can't alleviate the pressure that your ground forces are experiencing because you just happen to get unlucky with the weather, and in your specific area it's raining and you can't take off because the ground doesn't support your aircraft anymore. So this is something that I read a lot about the Eastern Front, where pilots were cursing the kind of localized area, and that's why they were also relocating quite often, or spacing out their Gruppen even, just the flights within the Gruppen on different airfields sometimes, just to kind of try to get around the natural conditions that exist on the front lines.
Yeah, I can imagine also this would probably cause some trouble with the army, and especially the psychological effect, which we discussed already once on the ground forces. If their own air force doesn't show up, is quite tremendous.
Yeah,
so I think we can wrap this up and answer some questions. What do you think?
Yes, I think that we pretty much talked about everything we wanted to say. We probably missed a few things, and we're going to slap each other around with those things in after the stream once we remember them, as it always goes. But yeah, if you guys have questions, feel free to ask them now. If you can, please mark myself, that's Bismarck, or Military History Visualized in your question so we can immediately read it.
Write an ad beforehand, before the name,
yes.
ad, and then because it highlights us in the chat.
Exactly, and that helps us see your questions better, and then we can answer them. And if you want to ask us something that is unrelated to the topic and right now, I think that's fair enough as well.
Yeah.
Okay, let me put my notes away here. Actually, I have so many books around me; it's unbelievable. They're all in grabbing distance, all around me.
Yeah, same here. And I have them in every room now.
Yes. Oh, yesterday I was going through all the chronicles for the Germans again and trying to find some examples and so on. And I think there's 2 books in my bedroom. There's probably one in the bathroom. I don't even know. So
there's a question for you actually.
Is there? Let's see.
Did Romania or any other German allies such as Bulgaria, etc., have an air force?
Yes, they did. Yeah, yeah. And they even had their own aircraft, some of them. And the interesting, most, at least personally, I find the most interesting the Finns, because they literally had a flying circus and they did really, really well in it. Yeah, they did. Actually, there's an interesting story with Romania switching sides and a German Jagdgeschwader being stuck over in Romania with all the flak guns around the aircraft being operated by Romanians. That's actually something I could maybe once make a video about. But it's quite a tragic story. The pilots get away, but yeah, a lot of people don't. Somebody asked, did Germans use frozen lakes as airfields like Finns in wintertime at Eastern Front? I think they did less so than the Finns and the Soviets, but I think I've read sometimes that they did, but I don't think they actually really enjoyed that all that much. Another question for me, by Psyrion, you guys mentioned that the runways and airfields were just fields. How common were actual concrete runways? In the grand scheme of things, very uncommon. Most airfields were grass and fields. You of course had also, during the winter, you had kind of compressed snow or flattened snow, ice, frozen fields, frozen lakes. But the real concrete runways were generally located in the West, that is Germany, France, and the UK, because those were peacetime airfields. The Germans at the end of the war sometimes also used their Autobahn. What do Paul Brockbank ask? What do you know about South Africa's involvement in Korean War? Well, I studied in Korea and actually looked at the Korean War a lot. And I'm ashamed to admit that I don't actually remember much about South Africa. I presume they sent maybe a division or something, but it's not, sadly, it's not something that I looked into great detail. I should ask my Korean friends. I have one Korean friend who's very much into the Korean War, and he would know immediately what to say at this point, but sadly I don't. Another question for me. Pixel Dispatch, do you have any interest in modern air forces today? Yes, less so than probably World War II, but yes, I am interested. I'm actually increasingly interested in it. Hi from Finland. Hi from my current location. This is a secret Hydra bunker. Again, a question. There's a question here for both of us.
Yeah. Did the SS have ever any flying forces? As far as I know, not. I think they had some Fallschirmjäger units, but I think they were commando units, or they were building them up. But not entirely sure. In Austria, the Bundeswehr probably had some airplanes, but I mean, when they were the Bundeswehr was completely integrated into the Wehrmacht. So they usually I read this, they replaced, for instance, in mostly Austrian units, they replaced usually officers with German ones or something else. So
it's I think the SS probably had liaison aircraft, and they could maybe commandeer an aircraft or two, but they didn't have any kind of flying forces. And with Austria, it's not Austria, but I know, for example, that some of the minor nations that fought on the German side, like, for example, Latvia and so on, they did have pilots as well, flying very outdated machines. I'm not quite sure on the independence of their specific unit. I would presume they were under German Luftwaffe command. In fact, I'm quite certain of it, because it wouldn't make any sense otherwise. Cat Scanner asks me what sparked your interest in the World War II aviation military history. I was a young kid. A friend of ours, like I mentioned, has an aircraft. He let me fly in the aircraft with him sometimes. He also had books on World War II aviation, and you go from there. It was just something very, something that I was very exposed to when I was very young. No. Is there another question here? There's quite a lot. What side had Bruno Tax asks? What side had the edge in terms of aircraft in the Eastern Front throughout the war? I presume you're asking for capabilities. That's a very, very big topic. There's people that wrote books on it, especially that topic. It depends what you're looking for. Early on, technologically speaking, the Germans had the edge. By 1943, I would argue that the Russians had the operational edge. Maybe not the technological edge for sure, but the operational edge. And the operational edge in that sense mattered more than the technical edge. And by 1945, the Russian aircraft were actually quite good. They had some really good designs. And Russian aviation generally is a lot better than what people give them credit for, and Soviet aviation with that, I mean. Christian West, and I think we're going to both handle this one. You guys have delved a lot into the environment part of the fighting condition, but could you also talk a bit about the organization, etc., were varied for the Allies between theaters? I don't know if you have something to say about that.
Wait, I just need to read because I missed it.
Christian West. I can read it again if you want.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I see it now. I mean, at one point we can all talk about the organization, but right now I can't tell very much because I didn't look at the organization of any air unit so far. Yeah, because the only thing I know is from Bismarck's video about air organization. But at a certain point, I will definitely look closer. I have a few copies on Jagd Geschwaders and also on. I mean, I mentioned one in the Japanese bomber tactics video, but it's just an overview. I need to read into this. The problem is that most people are not really interested in the organization so much, so I skipped those videos mostly, but they will come back in another way.
What I can say is that generally the closer you are to your quote-unquote home area, the more organized the squadrons are. And that's across pretty much all nations, with the exception perhaps with Soviet Union. The further away you are, for example, let's say Germans in Africa, the more flexible the units organize themselves in the theater. Same thing with the Eastern Front. When you look at the Eastern Front, how the Jagdgeschwaders organize themselves compared to in the West, it's very, very different. A lot more flexibility, a lot more small unit efforts, a lot less concentrated moves. And I think that kind of answers your questions in a kind of shallow sense, but we can't go into more detail at the moment. There's a question for you here, Bernard. Where those emergency runways you mentioned defended, and that's from Cessna T.
As far as I know, there were very few personnel stationed there, so it depends what you understand from defended. I think they had weapons or something, but basically I don't think they were mainly emergencies. So I don't think there was maybe some AA, but I can't remember exactly. But I don't think they had much there. It was basically just that people can survive and get some food and some water, and then they would get pulled out of there as soon as possible.
Yeah, bare minimum. Maybe there would be fuel, a little bit of fuel.
Yeah.
But I think if they noticed that the enemy was close, they would probably jump into a Jeep and run away or drive away if they could, if there's a road. Okay, there's a question here by Brendan. What were the airfields on the Russian-Japanese border like, and what was the air war in that area like? Well, the air war in that area didn't start, well, it started before what we in the West call World War II. Of course, over in Japan, in Asia, it started earlier. And at the very end. Now, I personally don't know a lot about that. I would imagine that there is maybe one or two central airfields that were extremely important and a few smaller ones spaced out. But maybe this is actually something that Justin could answer. Since it does go into the Japanese area. That would actually be interesting to know what both the Soviet Union and Japan did over there, because I don't think the air effort was all that big, or the reserve station there.
You mean during the Battle of Kharkov Go?
I would presume, because during World War II, as we know it, Soviet Union and Japan were in that war until the very end.
I got a book on this today, but I haven't read it. But as far as I remember, I talked with Justin a bit as this, and I think he mentioned particularly that drawing lessons from Kharkov Go has one problem, that the Japanese didn't really commit their air forces. So they kept them back or something. I'm not entirely sure here, but this is the thing. I actually found a page with the emergency airstrip, and it's mentioned that sometimes they saw combat action, but that was not the reason for their existence.
Yeah,
and they were manned by a handful of individuals, and yeah, They were mainly for recovering planes, so it's nothing too specific there on information on that. So basically what I remembered.
Muxi asks, how do you stop an aircraft on ice? First of all, you shouldn't see ice as in a flat, for example, in Finland on these frozen lakes, as a flat, just like a flat surface as in an ice skating hall. It's not like that. It's more rough ice, so there's a little bit more friction. Usually, you would also have a compressed cover of snow on it, and you would have skis. And then you would just use friction essentially to brake the aircraft. You do sometimes have these accounts of pilots, sliding on ice for quite some time, but eventually they would stop. Right, we have another question for both of us. Dorty Bro, he asks, military history and me, will you ever do a video on the siege of Sevastopol from the perspective of the Germans and Romanians?
I probably at one point will do a video on the siege of Sevastopol. I'm not sure if I will include the Romanians or not, or to what extent, because to a certain degree it depends on the sources, and also usually I cut a lot usually out of my videos, so it really depends on the situation. I can't confirm. Also, I did already a video on Romania that was specifically on Romania, and I want to cover more minor nations in general, but so since Romania already got one video, I probably will try to focus on another minor axis or a minor allied nation.
And there's a question again from Cyrion. How did they de-ice the planes when they had sub-zero temperatures? Yeah, they did have to de-ice them sometimes, especially when they're out in the cold and it snows during the night. However, they also usually cover them with planks and so on. I think at some point I heard somebody tell me once that you can use a kind of fuel to get rid of ice, but I'm not quite sure if that is something that they did on these planes, because you don't really want to put fuel on your aircrafts.
Yeah.
That is not something you want to do. I heard it, or maybe I read it somewhere, that maybe that was a trick, but I would be very careful when I do that, and I would not do that close to the engine. But I don't have absolutely no source on that, so don't take this as canon or whatever. Don't take this as me knowing what I am talking about. This is kind of brainstorming.
So I think we're nearing 1 hour.
Yes. Let's see. Lithuania, they were part of the Axis nation during World War II. Well, they kind of had no choice, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, oh yeah, exactly 1 hour. This is actually pretty good. I don't know if there's any last thing that you want to mention about this topic.
I think there was a question if we would do a complete video on this. I originally wanted to do a complete video on this, but the thing is, I assumed that the view numbers wouldn't be too high, and since every video takes at least 10 hours, but usually more to 20 hours, I now focus more on popular topics, and of topics I think they are less popular, but still interesting. I will try to put them in live streams. So this is my approach now. So basically, if there's a topic which gives a lot of good views, there's something different. And also, of course, the adcopolypse was a little bit problematic in that regard because, well, it still hits bad.
Yeah, the adcopolypse kind of hit all of us here on YouTube. Yeah. We're all on the same show together. So yeah,
we did you more than me. I mean, for me, it's not problematic in that I have to drop my channel or something, but it just like I had to pull back a lot on the expansion and also cut for instance, topics I would have covered beforehand. So now I'm more like, okay, I need to do more popular videos again. And this is, yeah. So I've tried to counter this by doing these live streams on topics, which I think is very interesting for our core audience, but not for the majority out there.
Yeah, the ad copy looks like we said, it wasn't pretty, and we do have to look into the YouTube analytics after each video and see, how was it, how is the audience, and how was it liked, audience retention and so on. And we do have to kind of adjust depending on that. It's something that we have to do. Since for Bernard here, this is his full-time job. For me, it kind of is as well at the moment. And without some income, we can't do this. So yeah, that's sadly the reality of the situation. Oh, there's Bo here. Hey, Bo.
Hey, Bo.
Hello. Okay, so I think this wraps it up. I apologize if we couldn't answer all your questions. There were quite a lot of them. We tried to get most of them. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having all of you guys here for the past hour, listening to us ramble on about something that we didn't expect so many people would show up. So very much appreciated that all of you support us in our endeavors. Of course, all of you know Military History Visualized. He's there in chat. So if you don't know who this guy is, do check him out. He makes absolutely amazing content on anything that is related to military history. You can learn a lot about them. The presentation is absolutely amazing, and it is definitely worth the time to put in. So, any final words?
Thank you very much. I'm blushing right now.
Nice, that's true.
Yeah, that's not.
Yeah, it's not. We're not used to
this. I'm not accustomed to that.
Let's hope that we stay humble and don't go off the rails like we did already twice in our country's history. As always, guys, before this goes anywhere further, thank you very much for being here, and we'll catch up with you guys on the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and see you next time.